We all know that ministry requires a lot of changes as you adapt to your context and try to reach more people. The question is, how can you introduce changes without having everybody freak out? The good news is that today in Practical Church Planting, we're going to give you 7 tips to help your church change.
Thanks for joining us again today on Practical Church Planting. We're going to be giving you 7 tips to help your church change without making people mad.
Yes, because churches like to change, people like to get mad. How can we avoid it?
That's true.
Well, real quick before we jump in, don't forget practicalplanting.com/launch. The Growing Your Launch Team course is out.
Yep.
And if you're listening to this in real time, you have 7 days to get it at only $99. After March 31st, the price goes up for good.
Yes,
So,
for good forever.
30 back, 100% guaranteed. Get your money back. We don't want you to waste your money, but if you're planting a church less than 2 years away and you're frustrated and you want to grow your team, if you don't want to grow your team, don't get it.
Not for you.
If you want to grow your team, get it. We've gotten a lot of great feedback. We're really excited about it. Practicalplanting.com/launch to give you a practical plan that you can actually do beyond just like raise money and build relationships.
Yeah.
Like, how do you actually do it? That's what the course is about. Practicalplanting.com/launch. Now, change happens a lot in
It
churches.
does. Yep.
And, especially if you're a church planter, you hear a lot of stories from pastors talking about trying to do like new initiatives and all these things and getting a lot of not happy people.
Mm-hmm.
So the question is, how can we live out our mission and do things that work, try things that don't work, and change things without getting people upset?
Yeah.
That is what we're going to talk about in this episode, because it applies to all of us. And so here's the first thing that we've learned. These are really a lot of things we've learned at New City in our time doing this.
Mm-hmm.
And here's the first thing. Expect and empathize with pushback. So one of the things that, I don't know why this happens, pastors get together and they talk about, which I get, like the difficulties of their jobs, but there's always not always, oftentimes there's complaining about people in their church not liking decisions. And first of all, as we've said in various episodes, whenever you change something in your church, you've probably been thinking about it, praying about it, talking with your staff, your elders. And so when you make the decision, you've been thinking about it for 6 months.
Yeah.
Everyone else is hearing it for the first time, so you should expect it. Like, you shouldn't be defensive or upset if somebody has questions or they don't like the idea because this is the first time they've heard about it and they haven't had time to process it. You should expect it, and then you should empathize with where they're coming from, because there's a good chance that you probably had some of those thoughts and objections yourself before you worked through how you were going to do it. And so it just helps you not get upset with people if you expect it to happen, because here's the thing. If you were going to the church and you were not the pastor and you heard of all these changes, there would be times where you'd be like, what's going on?
Yeah.
So expect and empathize with pushback when you do changes at your church.
Yeah, the good thing is that pushback generally means that the people care and care about the decision, care about the church, and want to do what's best. And so I think that pushing back on pushback, so to speak, can really kind of get you in some trouble, because you're kind of pushing out the people that really care and want to figure out kind of the reasoning behind what you're doing. And so listening to them, empathizing with them. I mean, there are times where potentially they may be right, and that doesn't mean you need to change anything you're doing, but just, listening to them and actually walking through and discussing why you're doing what you're doing will not just help people buy in, but I think will help them trust you more with those type of decisions in the future.
And it just helps your response. Like, if you think this is the best thing ever and you're super excited about it and someone disagrees, you could be upset.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you don't want to be upset, but you're just like, how could you disagree with this? But if you expect it to happen, then your posture towards it is more welcoming and inviting. If you even encourage people to ask questions. I think sometimes we don't want to say that because we don't want to face all these questions, but encourage it, because even if people agree or disagree, the fact that you are saying, hey, this is like your church and we want to save your feedback, it's not to say that you're going to change everything that you're doing, but at least people feel heard. And when people feel heard, even if they disagree, they're much more likely to go along with it than if they had a question or they weren't quite sure about something and they were met with, well, we're doing this, how dare you question our leadership or what we're doing? You need just to get on board. People don't want to be treated like that.
Yeah, I think this is one of the draws that people have towards, especially people that have been in church for a long time, to church plants in smaller churches is a lot of times people have experienced things like that in large churches where, I mean, once you get to a certain size, obviously you can't really get everyone's opinion, but it's to where they felt like a decision was made, and whether rightfully or wrongfully so, they felt like leadership just made a decision and it kind of blew them out. And I think that's one reason why some people are attracted to church plants, is they feel like this is a community thing and this is something that we all have a kind of all is saying, which isn't always necessarily true, but just blowing them out or just not listening to anything someone has to say or just acting like this is the decision, I'm right, and I'm not listening to anything else, I think can bring back some, I don't know, painful scars, or so to speak, of people who have spent a lot of time in church.
Yep. So just expect it, empathize with it. Just know that it's going to happen, and just be pleasantly surprised if it doesn't.
Yeah.
But if you're in the posture of I know this is going to happen, then you're going to be much more gracious when you hear it than if you think everyone's just going to agree and they should just get on board. So expect it, empathize with it. Don't be surprised with it. Number 2, you should be clear about why you are doing what you're doing, not just what you're doing, and not just how you're doing it. And in fact, you should talk about why you're doing it first, so that people understand what we're doing. There was this TED Talk, I think I mentioned it recently in one of our episodes, about how people make decisions in the parts of our brain, and I don't remember all the stuff behind it, but our decision-making faculties are in our emotional part of our brain, not in our rational or logical part of our brain. And so people always need to know why first, and they need to feel connected emotionally before they even care about what or how you're going to do it. And so, again, if you've been thinking about it for a while, you've internalized it, you know why you're doing something, but if you don't explain why you're doing it, then people might not get it. So, for example, let's talk about going from 1 service to 2 services.
Yeah.
It can be very difficult if you've never done it before, because it can, there's going to be less people in the room. People like being all together. Even the fact that not everyone, if you're at this place where you have to go to 2 services at your church, not everybody's like talking to each other anyway, but in their mind they have it that we're just like hanging out all together. And so you need to say not just what we're doing, like we're going to 2 services, or how we're going to do it, like the service times or whatever. You need to start with why. What's the mission of your church? To reach more people. You should hopefully you have things in place like groups or whatever where you can push people that want relationships to actually do it. But you need to talk about why, the mission. Yeah, sometimes you need to go to 2 services before you're actually full. And so people might be thinking, what's the point of this? And if you just say that we're doing it and how we're doing it, and you don't give them the reason why, they're going to be like, I don't understand. This doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
And so whatever decisions that you make and you want to change it, just tell them why. They don't have to agree. Like, they don't have to fully agree. Again, if going from 1 to 2 services, people don't have to agree that we should do this. But if they feel like you have thought about it and like the leadership have thought about it, and not just kind of like, oh, we just think woke up one day and thought it was a good decision, which doesn't happen, but people think that if you don't explain why you're doing what you're doing.
Yeah, and I think regardless of how obvious you feel like it seems, the why always needs to be explained. Like, if you're just in that example going from 1 service to 2 services and you're like, this room is packed, it's clear, it's painfully obvious we need to go to 2 services. Not everyone's seeing that. And people may have missed some weeks and not been there since it was a little lighter, if it's just a recent thing or whatever the reason, but giving people the actual reason behind what you're doing and not just making a decision, even if you feel like it doesn't need explanation. People need it. People don't know all the details that you know, and they need to know why you're doing something.
Yeah, just like, this is your job, so you're thinking about it all the time. The why might be obvious to you. We want to be on mission, 2 service example, we want to reach more people. Other people aren't thinking about that all the time. And so if you assume people know things, which we talk about this on this podcast, gets us in trouble all the time if we assume and we don't tell people. If you start with why, they may not agree, but at least show that you've thought about it and that there's at least a reason to do it. Yeah. They might not agree with the reason. They might not like the reason, but they can't say there isn't a reason. If you start with, here's why, we're going to go to 2 services. Let me tell you why, and talk about that for a few weeks. It was interesting back at our old space when we originally went from 1 services to 2 services. Even though it was like full because the place was small, there were still like, why are we doing this?
Yeah.
And we talked about it for a few weeks before we did it. And by the time we actually had to do it, people were like looking around the room. Like, people told me, oh, I didn't want to go to 2 services, but now I see it. Whereas if we had just said, hey, next week we're going to 2 services, or we're going to 2 services in a month, and not talked about, the mission and the why, like, people weren't thinking about it. Now they were. Some people at the time wanted to stay at 1 service, but they could no longer say it was maybe a bad decision because they understood the why behind it.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of with anything. It's seeking buy-in. Like, people need to understand why you're doing something, even if you feel like everyone should know. Not everybody does, and explaining why I think really helps.
So explaining why, and again, expecting and empathizing with pushback. When you say something, give people some runway too. If it's like a big decision, or don't expect that they're going to hear it and then that day be like, "This is great." It might take them a couple weeks, and that's okay. Which is why empathy is important. Number 3, and this one is really important because I feel like we have to do this and we don't. And that is, you do not have to have an answer for every objection. You don't have to have a black and white answer every time someone says, well, I don't think we should do this because of this, or what about this? And if you don't have a persuasive answer, you can feel like, well, this is a bad decision and they're right and we shouldn't have done this. I would say you have to do what you think is the best thing for you to do at your church. You explain why. You try to explain possible objections to it. And then if people object, you could say that's a great idea or that's a great thought. You could say, I hadn't thought, well, maybe you have thought about it. Here's the thing. People could give objections that are valid, but in the grand scheme of things, you still need to make the decision that you're making.
Yeah.
And so there's not always going to be like a solid answer for every single reason why you shouldn't make this decision. And I would just say you should be okay with it. I've heard it said this way, like when you have to make a decision that somebody's not going to like and they're upset about it, you could say, man, how does it phrase? Other than changing this decision, what can I do to help you, or what can I do to help you feel better about this, other than changing the decision that's actually made, and that might just be to happen again when your church is smaller. You kind of feel like everyone has to be 100% on board on everything that you do. When the reality is, people are willing to follow a leader. They don't always have to be right or know everything, but just like being humble and providing direction, people want that.
Yeah.
And so just don't feel like you have to have an answer to every objection, because you don't.
Yeah, and I think worrying that you need to have an answer to every objection is what will cause you to not make a decision.
Yep.
If you just are trying to come up with every objection, it's good to think through things, but if you're trying to come up with every objection beforehand, then you're worried about the objections that'll come up, and so you're afraid to tell everyone what's going on. I think that's what really gets people in trouble, and in the sense of that they never actually make a decision. And those are the leaders that people really honestly get really frustrated with. It's not the ones that make decisions they disagree with. It's the ones that never make a decision.
Yeah.
And so think through what you need to think through. Obviously you want to run it through things in your head and with people that, you respect and agree with and things like that. But once you need to make a decision, you need to make a decision.
Yep. And this, going back from the 1 to 2 service example, since we keep talking about that, there are valid objections to that.
Sure.
You like being in one room together. There's more people. There's more energy. What about serving? I don't want to serve. You might have to change how you're doing serving and all that sort of things. Those are valid questions. In the grand scheme of things, it still might be better for you to go to 2 services, and so you can explain, our mission. We want to create more space. Your concerns are still valid, but here's what we're going to do, and not feel like you have to give whack them over the head with a perfect answer to all the questions.
Yeah.
So
and like in that example, there are some decisions that are going to be harder for people. I think back to when we went to student services. I remember there's a family who drove further than most people, and one of their not necessarily objections but issues was like, this is going to be tough because we have kids and our kids aren't going to come to both services, and they served, and so kind of coordinating it all and not having to drive separately and equaling an hour's worth of driving each way. It was just tough. And so their concern was legitimate. This is actually going to be much harder on us than it was before. But it didn't change that. It's something that needed to be done. And so it's not like every objection is either legitimate or illegitimate, and every one that disagrees with us is an illegitimate decision or objection. But listening and explaining this is why we still need to do something, even if it may be a little tougher for certain people, is what I think will get people really on board.
And I think this is why, going back to the first point about empathizing and expecting it, is that a lot of people, I think when we assume that our decision is great and everyone has to agree with it, and then they push back and we feel like they're just trying to be against the church and they're just
divisive.
trying to, a lot of times people have legitimate reasons for why a decision might be more difficult for them than it would be for everyone else in the church, like the one Brian just gave. And so it doesn't change what we're doing. You empathize, you try to work with them best you can, but you say, this is what we're doing. And it being okay, not having a solid answer. Because honestly, here's what I found. Solid answers are good, but more than anything, people want you just to have a solid answer. So to say, I don't really know, I don't really have an answer to that objection, but I think we're still going to make this decision, that just sounds like we're not going to do it.
Yeah.
Or what are you doing? To say, here's why we're still doing it. I can understand why you might disagree, but we're still doing it. It's like, okay, at least I can respect the fact that a decision has been made and it's not all wishy-washy. And I would tell you, people will go along with a decision they do not like if it's compassionate, but it's a solid decision. Then it's one that's like, well, have you thought about X, Y, and Z? Then you're like, well, I don't know. Let me think about it, and then decide to still make the same decision. People don't want to follow that.
Yeah,
so,
true.
Yeah, just you don't have to have an answer for every objection. Number 4, this one's also difficult, especially if you're a church plant or a smaller church, and that is that you should not make exceptions when you make a decision. Because when you make exceptions, you're just going to make you're kicking the problem down the road, and you're going to have to make more exceptions for more people. So again, let's talk about 2 services. How we do serving here at New City, if you're on the hospitality team, for example, you serve once a month. You have a team, you serve the same Sunday every month. we're at one service now because we're in a bigger space, but it's going to be the same. We're going to have to do this again when we go to 2 services and make no exceptions. The team that you serve on both services, and you stay the whole time for the beginning. And you don't have to like necessarily sit in both services. But if you're like a door greeter, you're staying both services because after the second service, we want to greet people as they're leaving.
Yeah.
So when we first went to 1 to 2 services, the person who was leading our hospitality was talking to me how a couple people didn't want to do that. And he was trying to figure out how he could make an exception for them. And I said, we can't. Because what will happen is the new people that sign up to serve, once you make a decision, they just think that this is normal. So they don't even care about how you used to do things.
Yeah.
But if they sign up to serve and they see a few people don't have to do what everyone else has to do, well, then they wonder if they can also, only serve at one service and not, and, do it how they want to do it. So this is hard. You might not lose some people in terms of like lose people from the church, but like in this example, you might lose some people who are serving, but it is worth it to be in a little bit difficult situation in the short term to create the expectations that you want. So in the long term, you don't have any problems. The thing about it is everybody that had a problem with that ended up serving and doing what we asked them eventually.
Yeah.
Because it was just like, it's the new expectation. Everybody's doing it. And so don't make exceptions. Generally speaking, again, there could be a specific thing that you're thinking about where it's good to make an exception for one person for a reason. But generally speaking, you do not want to do that because then you're just going to have more problems down the road. If you make a decision, you need to kind of implement it all at once and allow people to have pushback, allow people to step back if they want, but you want to avoid making exceptions for people because it's just going to make your job harder in the future.
Yeah, I think hopefully everyone can kind of understand me by not making exceptions. Like obviously if someone is like has a medical issue and can't make it, it's not like a matter of like you need to be super hard on everybody. But when you make a change, it's important to not make exceptions for people that are just not really wanting to go along with the change. And like so in that example, greeters and things had to stay through both services. If that was something that someone who was previously greeting just is like, I cannot do this, then it's not necessarily a matter of like, well, then you can't serve, but maybe we have another position that you only have to say one service. Like maybe you're someone a church who's only
serving kids,
doing kids one
people
service.
Don't want to do.
Exactly. Yeah, right.
Give them an option.
Give them an alternative they don't want to do, and they'll do the first one. But have other options, and that way you're not making an exception. In other words, like if someone new comes on, they'll see this is the way we do things, not just for certain people, but for everybody. But also you're not just saying do it this way or else leave.
Yep.
Like if you have other options for somebody as they give sort of pushback or feedback, I think it really helps keep them on board. And honestly, in most cases, it'll help them probably stay in the position they're currently in because they're there for a reason. They're there because that's what they want to do.
It does make me like, I think, if you do that, you definitely can. And then still do what you're doing. Like, so there's one person in particular that didn't want to serve at 2 services. So they just stopped serving for a while.
Yeah.
And then they started serving again. And like that, you have to be willing to do that if there are not other, give options if the decision allows that, but just say, here's what we do. And we didn't make them feel bad. It's not like, I can't believe you're not willing to do 2 services. You don't love Jesus. It's just, that's totally fine. But this is how we're doing things now. And this is the expectations. And so to serve on the hospitality team, you've got to stay once a month for 2 services. And so that's what we do. So it can be really hard when the church is small. But again, I would tell you, people will respect that, especially the people that see you making the exceptions. They're not going to respect you. Yeah. But they know that there's some people that things might change a little bit. There's nobody's judging anyone. Nobody's mad. No one's upset. It's just, here's what we're doing now. We can't make exceptions. I'm telling you, like within like 2 or 3 weeks after you make that change, nobody will be even asking about exceptions. Like they'll understand. But if you're wishy-washy on it, or if you do make exceptions, it'll be a problem because you got to address the exceptions at some point.
Yeah, and this is why it's important to make when you make changes, make them kind of applicable to everybody because it's going to be really tough, especially in the beginning. If you just if something's serving, for example, or something like that, if you get pushback from like your largest donor, like it's tough in the very beginning. If you're like, I'm not sure if we can make it, and if this person leaves, like there's legitimate times where it's like, if this person leaves, we might be in big trouble.
Yes.
And it's very, I think, common for people to want to do everything they can to please that one person because they're afraid of them leaving. And I think that person really sees that. And the majority of the time, that person does not want that. Like the people want to be, especially generally larger donors want to be treated like everybody else. And to be catered to, even though you may think like, this is what I need to do to keep them. It's not healthy for the church, clearly. But also most of the time, no people don't actually want that. And so
Yep.
making sure that everything is just objective and clear across the board, and that you're not making exceptions for certain people will really help in the long run.
Yep. So don't make exceptions. And we're just telling you with experience, if you're newer or smaller, it feels so weird in the beginning. Now, when we make decisions, it's like you still empathize and you still care, but we know our decisions are decisions because we've done it. And I'm just telling you, if you're newer, you're smaller, people will be okay with it. They might push back a little bit, but as long as you're compassionate, but you're solid on what you're doing, then everything will be okay. So don't make exceptions. Number 5, this one's also important to not make people mad when you are changing things at your church, is that you need to bring vision and not apologies to new decisions. You don't need to say, here's what we're doing, and I'm sorry, I know this is inconvenient, I know it's different than what you're used to. You need to say, here's what we're doing, and here's why we're doing it, and here's why it's a good thing.
Yeah.
So again, I just we keep using the same example. Going from 1 to 2 services. Here's why. I mean, at New City, our mission is to help people meet Jesus and grow in a relationship with Him. More people are joining us, and we are accomplishing that mission. And so we want to make more space. It's not about numbers. I couldn't care less about how many people are here on Sunday in terms of checking a box or a list. But we want to help you meet Jesus. And so we're going to 2 services to create more space for that. You're giving, you're serving, how you love, your generosity is making that happen. So we're going to celebrate this. If you feel disconnected or if you're nervous about losing relationships, we would tell you to do 1 or 2 things: join a group, or serve, or do both. Because if you do that, you'll still have people that you see every week, and you're not going to feel disconnected if you do those things. Don't say, I'm really sorry, I know you really like one service.
Yeah.
Or I know, like, when you're serving, you're going to have to come earlier and stay later. Like, I'm really sorry. I mean, you can acknowledge that the change is coming, but you don't want to be all like, I'm so sorry this is happening, please forgive me. It's the same thing we talk about here when we talking about generosity.
Yep.
Like, people think churches talk about money a lot because whenever they talk about it, the pastor's like, I know this is awkward, or I'm so sorry. Whereas at New City, we talk about money. We did a sermon on giving in January. This coming Sunday, we're in Exodus, and it's all about generosity again. Like, the whole sermon. I don't think anyone would tell you that at New City we talk about money too much, but I think we talk about it more than most churches because we don't apologize for it. And so all that to say, when we make a decision, give vision, not apologies.
Yeah, if you're doing something, if you're making a decision, then hopefully you've thought it through enough to where this is going to be good for the church. Whether it's a decision, even if it's a sort of painful decision, most likely you should be doing it because it's for the betterment of the church. And if that's the case, then there's no reason to apologize for what you're doing. You should be selling the reason why it's going to be better for the church, even if it's something that is a more painful decision, like something where, I don't know, I'm going to go from 2 services to 1 service, maybe something like that. Something where it's like, we're doing this not for the happiest of reasons.
Yeah.
But you still need to explain why this is a good thing. This is a good decision that we're making for these reasons, and not just talk about how hard it's going to be for everybody. Because if you believe that it truly is, then it is, and that you need to explain that and cast some vision.
Yep. Yeah. So again, not to say that you shouldn't address how this could be difficult, but I wouldn't start by saying, hey guys, we got something to share. It's going to be hard for some of you. Say, here's what we got to share. Talk about like you're excited, because you probably are excited.
Yeah.
And then, you can acknowledge how it can be difficult, but don't let that be the big thing. Let the vision behind what you're doing be the big thing. Otherwise, you shouldn't make the decision. If you're really upset or scared about it, you should have conviction for what you're doing.
Yeah, for sure.
So bring vision, not apologies to new decisions. People will respect that. And they'll just like the giving example, they won't feel weird. They won't be upset if they can understand why we're doing this.
Yeah.
So that was number 5. Number 6 is to default to transparency. So let me give you hopefully this is not a controversial take, but this is one of my one of my frustrations with this COVID pandemic is just feeling like we were treated as children. So changing, this last year, what we were or were not allowed to do, if masks are good or bad, or how many people had to be vaccinated, like a certain percentage. It was lower than it was higher because they thought, well, Americans wouldn't like what we said or whatever. And so they thought it would discourage people from getting vaccines. And so you see a lot of that. And I'm not like, it's not a political thing. I'm just saying, I just felt we were often treated like children. They wouldn't tell us the facts, and they didn't trust us to make a good and wise decision. So it was like, we'll just tell them whatever we want to tell them to make them do what we want them to do. I would tell you should always default to transparency. You should tell people why you're doing what you're doing, and don't treat them like children. They will respect you for it. People understand that when you make decisions, there's a lot that goes into it. There's a lot of factors. And so if you try to pretend like there's not, it's like people know there are anyway. Yeah. And so I don't know, I'm trying to think off the top of my head of an example of what that transparency could be. But I don't know. Maybe as Brian's talking, I can think of something. But just like tell people why you're making decisions. Here's what we're doing. Like, for example, here's one. When we were raising money to move into this building, we talked about it all 2019. We ran out of space. This one came up. We had like a couple of weeks to tell them yes or no. And the only way to tell them yes is to like get people to commit to giving over the next 6 months, but we need their commitment in like 2 weeks. And so we told people like, yes, we want to move. Yes, we're out of space. This is great. But also, like, if we don't raise the money, we're not going to move. Not as a guilt thing, not as a, and I guess we didn't necessarily have to say that. We could have just said, raise this money, it's going to be great. But it just felt like it was helpful to do. I feel like it was beneficial. I don't know if that's the best example. But if there are things that you need to be transparent and honest about, have vision, like be excited, don't apologize, but also be transparent. People will appreciate that.
Yeah, and I think people will be able to tell when you're not transparent. Like if you have sort of a ulterior motive for making a decision, or you're not being honest about the reason that this decision's being made, and just trying to like, especially if it's a tougher decision, just trying to like sugarcoat it and make it seem like it's good for everything, even though, or good for everybody, even though there are some like legitimate tough parts of this decision. Not acknowledging it, I think people will see right through it. I think people will see that you're just trying to kind of, whether intentionally or unintentionally, like pull the wool over their eyes a little bit and not being honest about the situation. And so I think this one might be a little I don't know, tougher if it is a tough decision. Hopefully, if it's a good decision for everybody, it's easy to be transparent in the reasoning. But if it's a tougher decision, like whether there's financial issues or like a issue with someone in leadership or something like that, it can be really tough to be transparent and say, this is the reason why we're making this decision, and it's gonna, especially if it's gonna hurt. But not being transparent, I think, is really going to hurt you in the long run.
Yeah, and people they'll just respect it. I know this wasn't a decision that had to be made, but in the course of COVID, we've had 2 people that have gotten COVID and came on a Sunday and didn't have any symptoms. They didn't know they were sick till after. Now, we've had no spread. Like, we've had no issues. No one else got sick from it. But, we're a smaller church, and so actually, I can't remember all the details. I know one came, I think one person served, but didn't actually go into the service for one of them. But both times, we told the whole church. And depending on, I know churches have done this differently. Some have, some haven't. We could have, looking back on it, since it didn't spread, like, we could have gotten away with not telling anybody, especially because, less people came both times we said it, and that was kind of a bummer. But it just felt like, if you want people to feel ownership that this is their church, you have to treat them as if like this is their church, and they want to know things about that are happening so they can be better prepared to help and just feel like they have ownership. I think especially this is making changes is a way that can help people feel more ownership or feel less ownership. If they just feel like they're talked to, or they're not heard, or their objections weren't answered in the form of maybe they didn't ask you, but like you didn't come up front and say it, because whenever you make a decision, you kind of can know some possible objections. The people feel unheard and they feel disconnected. If they feel valued and if they feel like the decision, even if they disagree with it, there was good reasoning behind it, they'll feel more ownership. And so transparency is just a great way to help people feel like their church is actually their church and not the pastor's church or the staff's church. And
being transparent in the smaller like decisions is really going to help with the bigger ones. Like that COVID example is really good, because thankfully nothing big ever like happened with New City. But if it had, or something that we had to like tell people, like something more serious happening, they'd be more likely to kind of trust what we're saying, because in the smaller examples, they knew that we were being honest with them and that we weren't like hiding anything, whatever. And so being transparent, even in the sort of smaller decisions where you feel like everyone's just going to buy into this, but being transparent in the reasoning, I think is really going to help when you have some of the more difficult or bigger decisions to explain, and people will listen because they know that they've been honest with me in the past. I trust that they're going to again.
Yeah, and this one is maybe not necessarily just for decision-making or changes, just in general. It's just people appreciate that. So, for example, one of the things that we do is every quarter we send out a giving statement. And we've talked about this in previous episodes, but we also share our budget, where we are for the year, just so people can know. A lot of times people want to help their church. They just don't know because they haven't been told. And so if there's needs, or if things are going well, things aren't going as well, just lean towards transparency all the time, and people will feel more ownership about their church.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this leads us to the last one, last but not least, number 7, the 7th tip to help your church change without making people mad, is to test your potential decisions on trusted church members. Now, I've done this. I do this from time to time. People that are like pretty bought in, and I'll kind of frame it as, I did this like 2 weeks ago, and I cannot even. Now that we're talking, I forget what it was. I don't even remember. Great, good job, Dylan. I was having lunch with somebody, and there's something that we're doing here at New City. Man, you would think I would know. I'm totally blanking. As soon as we're done recording, I'll think of it. Like something we were thinking about doing, and I didn't say we're going to do this, but I was kind of like, I think we're going to do this. Here's kind of the plan, just to get people's reactions. And I'm not even like I mean, I guess I can't. I am sort of asking what they're thinking, but I'm not. Before I even ask what they think, I just kind of tell them and see, like, do they like it or do they not? And so that's something you could do. Is again using the 2 services example.
Yeah.
Like you could test, when you're hanging out with somebody, saying, here's what we've been thinking about. We're thinking about going to 2 services, and here's why. And just to like say it and just sit back and see how they respond. It can help if you explained it well. It gives you a somewhat of a pulse about people who are invested in your church, what they might think. Not to say that you change the decision, but it lets you know if you've explained it well. And if you get this positive feedback a couple of times with a couple of people, well, then when you announce it from stage or whatever to everybody, you already have a few people that have heard about it and thought about it, and so they're more likely to already be like, this is a good thing, which can help everyone else get on board as well.
Yeah, I think having people that you can talk to, I mean, at the end of the day, we're talking about like how to make decisions, but there are some times where you have a bad idea. Like there's some times where you want to make a decision and you shouldn't, and so kind of testing the waters a little bit, especially if you have people that you really trust, like if you have a management team or elders or something like that, telling people beforehand and being willing to be told that you shouldn't do this. You need to be once you decide that you're making the decision, you need to be confident in it and things like that. But there are times where you want to make a decision and there are things that you haven't thought through that are presented to you, and it should make you realize I should not make this decision, whatever it is. I don't have an example, but whatever it is. And so talking to some people ahead of time will really help you kind of weed that out. Not that you're going to them saying, should I do this or should I not do this? But if it's clearly a poor decision, then if you're going to people that you trust, they'll point out the reasons, and you should listen. And that doesn't mean change what you're doing. It may not, but it's just listen to people that you trust and that are wiser than you, and make decisions from there.
And I've also found it can be helpful because sometimes people will ask you questions that you didn't really answer because you thought it was obvious, and they're not pushing back. They're just like, "Well, what about this?" And you, in your mind, you might be thinking, "Well, isn't the answer obvious?"
Right.
But clearly, it's not. And so that's a way to when you're explaining this on a larger scale to more people, to address this question that, again, people that aren't thinking about ministry 24/7 in your church, and they're not like on Sunday morning, you're looking at how much people are there, what's the vibe like, are people being greeted, you're looking at all these things. Everyone else is not paying attention.
Yeah.
And so they're going to think things or maybe ask what you might consider obvious questions because they're just not in this mindset 24/7. And it's not because they're dumb or they don't care. It's just they're focused on other things, just like you would also be thinking those same things if you had another job and this wasn't your primary thing.
Yeah. I think I don't know. It'll help you realize or help you see like what obvious questions are going to come up. Especially if you can talk to people like elders or a management team, like if they bring up questions, even though they're most likely not as invested day to day in the church as you are. I mean, they're invested, but not like the pastor is. But if they bring up questions, then you can be sure that people who are just coming once a month or a couple times a month are going to for sure bring up questions. Yep. And so it'll just help you kind of get your feet wet with this decision and figure out kind of some of the common objections and if it's something you should move forward with or not.
Yeah. So again, test potential decisions on trusted church members to get their feedback, maybe able to think through some things, and just to get their buy-in before you make the big announcement.
Yes.
So those are 7 tips to help your church change without making people mad. You might have exceptions. I always feel like church planters, sometimes you get worried because you hear everybody's horror stories, and then you feel like that's just every week something crazy is going to happen, which it doesn't happen that way. But yeah, people don't have to get mad. There is always going to be some pushback and some questions, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. And if we assume it's a bad thing, then we'll kind of respond in a negative manner. But it just means that people care.
Yep.
So hopefully that was helpful for you. Speaking of helpful, if you're getting ready to plant a church, practicalplanting.com/launch. Get in on the Growing Your Launch Team course. It'll help you give a practical plan to plant your church, to help your church grow and reach more people. So if you want to grow your launch team, that's your course. If you don't want to grow your launch team, just ignore it.
Nothing for you.
So thanks for being with us, and we'll be with you next time on Practical Church Planting.